Hello, God be with you. That was for the people still out there getting cookies. It's been a long but fruitful day, and we have been ignited and energized and troubled and encouraged by Heber Brown III, who has come to be with us here in this Theological Commons gathering. And so we are really glad to end. He's going to do, he said, a more reflective piece tonight. I can't even imagine how he's not also going to, he is a contemplative. I know it's hard for y'all to believe that the way he was today, but he is actually a contemplative. And take us deeper into the ways in which food has been used against us and for us. So I'm looking forward to this evening's lecture, interaction, whatever this is going to be. I trust, Spirit, that it's going to be good. You can read for yourself, but I didn't say this today, but Dr. Heber Brown III is a pastor. He is a pastor at Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, and they free him to do the work that he does. And we had a conversation a couple of years ago about, is it time for me to leave the church? And it suddenly dawned on him that it is the church, and this may sound like a pun, but it's not. But it is the church that grounds him to do this work, so that it would almost be antithetical to leave the church to do the work for the church food network, Black Church Food Network. So he is a pastor. He's also a father, and the reason I want to tell you that he's a father is because his kids are funnier than he is, and they are becoming quite the little gardeners themselves. They know probably as much about gardening as he does, and probably maybe more because they have more time to Google than he does. So maybe he'll tell you a little bit about his farmer children and his gardening children and what that's like. He has a spouse who cares about this work as a work of justice as much as he does, and maybe he'll tell you a little bit more about that. He's grounded this work also in the style of the Freedom School movement that started back in the 1950s and 60s. You may know the Freedom School movement. If you don't, Google it. It will bless your life as you read it. But these schools started across the South mostly and then spread out. And they were places where children, Black children, could be taught not just their heritage, but something around the dignity of what it meant to be Black in a world where being Black was often, they were often assaulted. Personhood was often assaulted. And so the Arida Freedom School is not, although he founded it there at his church, it is a part of a larger movement, and you just need to know that. The work that he's doing with us this week, or today, and tomorrow he'll be here for a colloquy that we're doing, but the work that he's doing is a part of our larger work as an institution where we're trying deeply to be connected to the communities where we are, to whom we find ourselves accountable. It's not, we don't want to be a light under a bushel, but rather a light on a hill, and accountable to and among the people that we serve, not just our students, but our alum and the local community. And so the Theological Commons is the place by which we try to make that interaction visible and purposeful. I want to recognize a couple of people in the room before Dr. Brown starts. I get so excited about this that I forget the protocol. And you know, for a woman who grew up in the Black church, I can't even believe that I forget protocol sometimes. It's like, you grew up in Black church, first giving honor to God who is there. When you know better. It's like, What is wrong with you? So I want to recognize that the president of MTSO has been with us most of the day, Reverend Jay Rundell, who gives us all of the support we need to pull these programs off. Say hi to Jay. And support. Yes. And the person who maintains the logistics for Theological Commons is also here, Kathy Dixon, and so I want to recognize her. She puts the moving pieces together, and that's helpful to us. One of our farmers is among us and gave the tour to you all, and so I want to recognize, she hates it when I do this, but I want to recognize that Noelle is here, and to just recognize that if you ate in the dining hall today, it was because of the good work of people like Noelle, so just wave. I don't think any of the interns are in the room. I think I've covered everything. There are faculty, students, and friends among us. We are thankful for you being with us. Without me talking anymore, let me turn you over to Dr. Brown.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. I am so, I remain grateful. Many of you have been here, as Dr. Bridgman said, for a good chunk of the day, if not the whole day, and you have been so kind as I have wallowed in verbosity all day today, and I appreciate it. Tonight, I would like to invite some reflection, but also some interaction, and so while I know it said lecture, I really would like us to speak one with another and allow the wisdom of the room to bubble up around us as well. And so for the sake of those who may not have been with us earlier today, I'll give some summary of the work that I'm blessed to be a part of with the Black Church Food Security Network. But then I want to pivot from there and invite us to come to terms in some ways, to come to some terms and really work with really kind of sit with some of the terms that we hear in this space around food security and even the term food security, and investigate, explore, and dig for some of the underlying assumptions that prop up those terms, what they mean and what they lead us to. But before I start, can I just shake your hand?
Nice to meet you.
What's your name again?
Noelle.
Noelle. You know how long I've been thanking God for the hands that prepared the food? And it's always been a hands out there somewhere. But what a great gift and joy to actually see the hands and see the person that I'm praying for. And we are all grateful for the wonderful ministry. Let's give her another hand. We're grateful for the work we do. I've been saying, please, Lord, bless the hands that prepared it for so long. It's just a treat to shake the hand of hands that are preparing this wonderful food. So allow me to give an overview. Again, I am so blessed to be the really chief cheerleader of the Black Church Food Security Network and one of the evangelists of the work that we do. Before I forget, I have about 100 brochures that I brought just for y'all. I don't want to take it back on the plane, so even if you don't need a brochure, if you're composting at home maybe, or you need something, your children need a coloring sheet when you go to dinner, just take one, please. They're on that chair in that box. And it shares more about the Black Church Food Security Network and our approach to the work and why we do what we do. So just in a nutshell, for those who were not with us earlier, the Black Church Food Security Network, one, I'll start with this not. It is not a food charity program. It's not a food charity program. That the Black Church Food Security Network really helps to set stage and create interface for deeper engagements of community that involve and embrace and celebrate and guard autonomy and identity amongst those who are and have been historically marginalized and oppressed in this country, whether in the dimension of food or other areas as well. So what that means in terms of praxis is we, springing from the bosom of the Black church experience, seek to align and organize the resources of churches, material and otherwise, toward the direction of sovereignty. And I want to talk more about Black food and land sovereignty and its importance to the bigger picture of some of the things that are related to this work. And so, I said it earlier, African American churches as an institution and as a collective is the one institution that Black folks can point to and say, we have more than 300 years of receipts when it comes to this institution. That we can point to libraries, clinics, schools, programs, projects, mutual aid societies, credit unions. We can point to this institution and say, for more than 300 years, since the late 1700s, Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, AME, since the late 1700s, this institution has been a springboard to help bring about some of the greatest aspirations of Black people in this country. It is an institution that at many points has, so many foibles and fumbles and outright failures, but also so many tangible and concrete benefits and assets as well. And so that's very important. Not only has it produced for more than 300 years, it has also withstood for more than 300 years. What do you mean? I mean that when you look at the history of this country, and when you look at and consider all that this country and all that Black folk in this country have been through, this is the one institution, or perhaps some others, but this one really stands out, that has withstood the test of time, challenge, and confrontation. Through the Great Depression, the Black church still is here. Through crosses burning on the lawn, the Black church is still here. Through 4 little girls being bombed in 16th Street Baptist Church, Black church still here. My classmate, one of my classmates at Wesley, his name was Clementa Pinckney, pastor of Mother Emanuel. And after the horror and the terrorism of that tragedy at that church, the following Sunday, that congregation got together and worshiped the Lord and came together. If I was a violent white racist, I'd be pissed off at the Black church too. I really would. Because no matter what those elements throw at the African American congregation and church, it just keeps bouncing back. And it bounces back in ways that inspire further growth. And so, in philanthropic arenas, there's a lot of talk about sustainability. And I know no institution that has the level of sustainability owned by Black folk outside of the Black church. And so I really want to bring you to my mind in terms of strategy, that this being birthed in the bosom of the Black church was very intentional. Because it's the institution that I believe when I'm dead and gone, this institution will continue forward. And food is going to be an issue now, just like it was then, and needs some type of home to hold this kind of effort. So the strategy of all this, y'all, I'm kind of bringing into my mind around strategy. The strategy was intentional to have it be in the Black church. Because of that, it withstands, it has receipts. And it is less susceptible to being overtaken. The autonomy of the black community inside their own churches is less susceptible to those outside of the black community coming in to steer it in the direction they wanted to. Now, there are ways that has been attempted. Some would point to the faith-based initiatives under Bush to help influence and steer churches in a particular direction. So there have been attempts at that. So I understand, I recognize that, I concede that. But by and large, it's an institution that is fairly resistant from being influenced by external forces and factors. And so that's some of the reasoning and rationale behind what it is and why we do what we do through the black church. So we look at churches and we help churches to see the things they already own. We help them to see them with fresh lenses, new eyes, and more courageous imagination and creativity. That while you call that a church kitchen, it could just as easily be a community kitchen. When you call that a church bus, it just as easily can be a food distribution truck, which I found in the middle of the Baltimore uprising. You call that a Sunday school classroom, it could just as easily be a political education room for your community. And so just reimagining the existing resources and thinking about them in ways different than how we customarily use them. Why is it important? It's important because, one of the reasons it's important is because Monday through Saturday, these same assets sit largely unutilized or underutilized. One of the things that when I first started pastoring, the blessed people who reminded me when I got there, they said, Pastor Brown, I got shoes older than you. And given the good home training that I have, I said, yes, ma'am, you do. And the other thing, one of the things they wanted from me in that time, especially that first year, they wanted pastoral office hours. Oh, they wanted office hours. We paying you that good money and them Baptist dollar bills and that offering plate. We want to know when you going to be in the office. Okay. Office hours. So that first year, I complied. And I set office hours. And I sat in the office by myself. Nobody came to Pastor's office hours. And so I did that for a few weeks, couple months. And then after a while, I stood up on Sunday and gave a reminder during pastoral announcements. Y'all know I have office hours. You're more than welcome to come and check me out. I was sitting in the church with the typewriter by myself. And while sitting there by myself, I started walking around the church and talking to God all by myself and realizing that all of this stuff that the church already owns. I'm in a particular kind of dynamic at our church where we had some saints up in there who raised the money and paid everything off. So I'm grateful that I don't have some of the pressures that some of my colleagues have. When, let's say, inclement weather or something comes up, we just shut down without a second thought. Be closed. Some of my other colleagues have to think a little bit deeply because they got a mortgage to pay on that building, and they got a note to pay. And so, but not our case. Pleasant Hope paid off. I'm walking around looking at paid off stuff. Paid off stuff. Brought everything. Paid off. Paid cash. Paid off. Done. Okay, we finished. And saying, what more could be done with the stuff we already own? Those office hours really gave me a good view, because Monday through Friday, as I'm sitting there by myself, I'm saying, wow, we have all this stuff that can be used for greater purpose. But also what I learned was, in terms of my approach to ministry, I learned that I could do some things Monday through Friday, and the folks who come on Sunday wouldn't even know I did it during the week, so why not just try something different? So the Freedom School is one of those efforts that, out of that history that Dr. Bergman spoke to in the mid-20th century, and even prior to that, there have been other iterations of freedom schools in our history, and free schools as well. But given the challenges around public education in Baltimore City, I was one who would constantly critique all of the things that the Baltimore City public school system was not doing, particularly for black children in our city. And when I became a pastor, I began, and really it was when it was on my 30th birthday, kind of in that season. And on my 30th birthday, I wrote it down in my journal where I received kind of just a clarity during that time in my life, where the clarity was, okay, Heber, you're great. You have critiques on everything. Wonderful. Critique what is, but create what should be. Critiques are important, but reserve some of that energy to create the alternative reality that you think ought to be. With that in mind, I said, well, all right, I had this building, I have these classrooms, I have this church bus. We can start a school right in this church. So on days when Baltimore City Public School is closed, we open. Professional development days, spring break and summer, we open up. Our community thanks us because, especially on those professional development days, if not at the church, many of those children would just be home, sitting home all day. Or parents would be struggling trying to figure out what to do. We open up the church. And the Freedom School, we have an African-centered Freedom School at our church because one of my critiques, again, was that my schooling put me in a place where I had to be expert on Napoleon, Christopher Columbus, and Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. But when it came to my own history, I didn't get that information. And there were some convenient things left out about people like Thomas Jefferson. You know, the rape, Sally Hemings. But the history books painted it as a romantic relationship, that kind of stuff. And so I remember that as a boy, and I said, if I started school, and we did, I said, now Freedom School, we're going to give black children an orientation to the world that starts with their ancestral identity, an African-centered school experience. And so we do that on professional development days, spring break, summer camp. We pour libation to African ancestors. If you were here earlier, you saw on the screen our ancestor altar. And after pouring libation and going through and having breakfast, and our children cooking the breakfast in that church kitchen with adult supervision, of course. But they cook the breakfast, they cook the lunch, we sit down together, we eat a meal together, no technology at the table, we sit and have family meeting, or family dinner, family meal, right in our Freedom School. And then a series of workshops, sewing, herbalism, culinary, agriculture, going down the line. And so some of us remember classes, home ec. Y'all remember home ec? Anybody remember home ec? Oh, yeah. They don't do it a lot in a lot of other schools no more, but home ec, so we bring a lot of the spirit of those classes back, a lot of hands-on learning, how to change a tire, how to tie a tie, all that kind of good stuff. And these 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10-year-olds eat it up and love it. And they own it. They give direction in terms of what do they want to learn the next day, or the next week, or the next time. And we create together the school experience that will be helpful, and a school experience that lends toward the liberatory project of black people in Baltimore. And so that, thank God for pastor's office hours that allowed me to reimagine existing space, and then that spills over into the land. This land that we just pay somebody to cut the grass. The land is already, if any church is present, the land you own is already on your budget somewhere. It's already there. So when I go to a church and talk to a pastor about doing something different with it, I'm not coming trying to add something, a line item to your budget. I'm coming to say it's already there. But if you steer resources in a different direction, it could do so much more. And when you partner what you're doing with what they're doing and they're doing, and so that's where the network aspect of the Black Church Food Security Network comes to play. We just connect and link the churches, and we had great discussion earlier about the ways in which food can bring people together, even in ways that denominational identities might be problematic in other ways such as that. And so it just became, just looked at a reimagining of the spaces that we occupy in creating almost maroon communities in these churches. Maroon communities, African maroon communities, historically, like around the Great Dismal Swamp and in Haiti and other places where African folk got together and said, we're going to create community in places where it wasn't designed for us to be. And so in a sense, I have a maroon mentality when it comes to the Black Church Food Security Network, where we can create some spaces in the midst of challenge and meet our needs together and share in that cooperatively as well. I want to pivot here and talk about, the title I shared earlier was something along the lines of Beyond Food Deserts. There's a quote that says, "Until lions have historians, hunters will be heroes." Until lions have historians, hunters will be heroes. So goes the oft-quoted proverb attributed to the deep wells of African wisdom. The quote helps sensitize us to one way in which privilege and power help determine which perspective is amplified and deemed worthy of being remembered. This quote comes to mind when I think of the text I preached earlier today in chapel, in Mark, the miraculous feeding miracle that happened as Jesus fed the masses who had followed him out to what the Bible describes as a deserted place. However, as I said earlier, this deserted place had evidence of life long before Jesus and the crowd got there to label it a deserted place. Furthermore, in that passage, in this encounter, and in other Gospels, as shared with a little earlier right before the session, but other Gospels talk about how many people were blessed by way of that miracle. Y'all remember the number? 5,000 men, not including women and children. And so my question was in Sunday school many years ago was, why in the world would anybody take the time to count 5,000 men but not count the women and the children? 5,000 men, but didn't count the women and the children. Until lions have historians, hunters will be the heroes. I think of the importance of this quote also when it comes to like Daniel chapter 1 in Scripture. Daniel and the 3 Hebrew boys, though their names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the churches of my upbringing continued to call them by their slave names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And in fact, when the Black Baptist preacher get real happy, they say not Abednego, what they say? A bad Negro. But let's go back to 9-year-olds in Sunday school. If Scripture says what their names are, and then says, and these are their slave names, why is it that there seems to be a preference to continually identify them by their slave names and not by their birth names? Who's telling the story matters, and words matter. Which brings me to the term food desert. 9-year-old Heber in Sunday school says, where in the world did the term food desert come from? And what does it mean? How did it become so common in the language of the food security circles that we say it without conscious thought to what it actually is implying and what it might mean? Food desert. As I said and preached earlier, desert is a natural occurring phenomena. There's nothing unnatural about deserts. But there is something unnatural about policies, about laws, and about planning departments that structure communities in such a way that puts them out of reach of the basic necessities that any community that wants a high quality of life would want for itself. There is something unnatural about grocery stores and banks and other job opportunities and quality schools divesting and moving out of a neighborhood and then victimizing those who live there and blaming them for the dynamics in which they face and live in. That's unnatural. But to say food desert continues to obscure in many ways the root and reality of what's at the base of the issue. In fact, in here, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, one of the greatest books ever, that I've ever read, and I commend it for those who have not been blessed by that book yet. He says, to surmount the situation of oppression, people must first critically recognize its causes, so that through transforming action, they can create a new situation, one which makes possible the pursuit of a fuller humanity. To surmount the situation of oppression, people must first critically recognize its causes. And here, I would like to invite the wisdom and genius of the room to the fore. I want us to, together, perhaps in some group in dialogue, try to unearth some of the root causes that food deserts, that term, shields and keeps us focusing on other things like access. Because if food deserts are held up by a desire to get people access, it would lead you to believe that as soon as you get access, all the other issues will be solved and settled. So there's some issues there. So what's really beneath the term? What are we really trying to say? Let us come to terms. What are we really trying to say when we label a community a food desert? I know what the USDA says, and I'm not asking you to regurgitate what the USDA says. I'm asking you to think about what is being implied underneath the term food desert, and are there other terms that can better describe some of the root causes that have us in the situation in the first place? Can we take a second, in fact, lean and find a friend. Somebody you don't know if you can. Find a friend. Find a friend. What are we really, oh, y'all don't know each other? Make a friend too. Y'all don't know each other. Make a friend. What do we really mean? What's beneath the term? Take 3 minutes or so. What do we mean? Yeah, once we come out of this. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Shannon, do you know what time this is scheduled to end?
We usually run about 90 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. So what do we do? We started at 7. So, okay, 8:30 or so we should be wrapping. Perfect, thanks. Family, let's take about 2 more minutes. 2 more minutes. Another minute, 60 seconds. All right. All right, family. Let's come back together. Let's come back together. I feel, listen. I know. I just started, right? I started hearing hand clapping, and I said, all right, Holy Spirit, come on up in here. Good conversation, good sharing. I was doing some eavesdropping and ear hustling on different circles as you were sharing. I've been blessed by the insight, and there's a few that I wrote down, but I also wanted to ask others to share some of that, the wisdom and the goodness that you were hearing, and perhaps you got an invitation to a different perspective on the term and some of the assumptions that are underneath that term. I want you to share those as well. So who heard something that really moved you and pushed you and said, wow, I never thought about it like that? Oh, and we have mics, right? We have microphones coming around. So I saw you jump. No. Was that you? Not you. Oh, okay, all right. Just put a mic in front of people.
I'm a preacher, I'll talk.
Any others? Kick us off. All right, I'm gonna call somebody. Oh, good.
So we were talking about, in a way, the negative connotation of desert. I don't think I knew, this is embarrassing, sorry, that...
Safe space.
I know, right? The way that I looked at deserts were bad. They were what do we say? But they were a result of something going wrong. They weren't something that was naturally occurring, and therefore I didn't value the ecosystem that is maintained in the desert.
Yes.
I didn't value it because I thought that the reason why it was that way was because something was wrong. And then we were also talking about how with the idea of a desert, if it wasn't a naturally occurring thing, which I think I had the idea that it was not a naturally occurring thing, then the question becomes, well, if there was life or water there at one time, we don't consider when we're saying food desert, well, how did that life get sucked out? Like that didn't just happen on its own. So so I kicked it off, so I'm done.
You kicked it off good and right, too. I appreciate your insight, yeah. And listen, y'all, safe place, right? So no, you don't got to own, whatever. Safe space, safe circle, yeah.
So I didn't understand the term. So I just knew children were hungry. And I think using those terms, it takes away from the life of the child. So if you can call it a desert, it's going to be more like inanimate, like sand is inanimate.
Okay.
But whereas if you want to talk about children being hungry and families being hungry and that whole thing, then that you just dehumanize them. I thought also when I don't include those terms, even though I have to write grants. We talk about children being hungry. So the other piece to that for me is when you think about a community, the fact that, and we talked about this with our wage, that you get pushed back on people having a living wage. And so as a result of that, you don't have to address the economic underpinnings of why there's not availability of cash in the community for people to be able to purchase food or purchase the selection of food to prepare a meal. And so when you get to a pantry, and I use pantries because we use them for after-school programs, so they provide resources for our communities. You may not get all you need for meal preparation. And so I came from a mother who cooked from the South, so you can put a whole bunch of things together to make a meal. And I always knew all of the elders in the community who could do that for us. But I think that that's another piece that's left out, that in a community meal, it's a sharing and that fellowship. And so when you don't have the opportunity to fellowship around food, which most cultures do, to celebrate, so now you're taking away culture too. And so for me, what the pushback is now you're even taking them farther away from their humanity. Because now you're saying not only do they not have food, they don't have a culture, they don't have a language, so they don't have a voice.
That's rich. I'm getting goosebumps, y'all, because we are swimming upstream a little bit from that term. I know, do we have, where are we next?
With our group, some of the discussion, and one of the things that I mentioned, I think that I look at my own church, and the majority of the people in the church live outside of the community. They drive into the church. And I think as black people, we gave up on our own communities. Because when I was growing up and younger, everything occurred at the church and in the community. If Miss So-and-so was sick or just had the baby, grandmother's sending pots down there, and Katie, you go and take that, and you do this and you do that. So we had a strong sense of community. But once we believed that we had to do it for ourselves, like you were saying, you got to I hate when people say pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And I think about, what about the people that don't even have boots or shoes? What are they going to pull up? And so once we left our own communities, those that were not able to get out through lack of education or whatever the reason, they stayed there, and then they became dependent on what was given to them, food stamps, whatever, those types of things. So it's a myriad of things that happened.
Can you share? I was ear hustling as you were sharing and talking about, was it your mother or? My mother. You were talking about how she was taking care of white children or something like that?
My mother was a day worker. And she took care of white children. And when my mother passed, it was just almost more white children there crying over her than black. And then after rearing those children, she had to come home and deal with us, the 5 of her own. And I think sometimes that leads to that early death. You know, you literally work yourself to death. And we had people crying on the coffin, but she was allowed only to go in the back door. So it just, when I talk about it, it makes me full. But in striving then to better yourself with that individual thing, peace, whatever that is. You know, I'm 74 years old and I'm still trying to find out what that peace is. What does it mean to be an individual? Jesus didn't mean for me to do that. He meant for me to be in community with my brothers and sisters and help them. And together we get out. You know, we didn't know what a food desert was until just recently. You know, our communities were full. Ida said she's from a family of 10 children. She didn't even know they were poor until she got out and somebody told her she was. So.
Can you just speak your mother's name in this space?
Margaret Ford.
Ashe, Ashe, thank you.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on what we had, to wrap up what we said in regards to the notion of the desert, recognizing that it's this space where this is a manufactured desert, right? Because it's not, from a food, you look at the term food desert, it's not a natural occurring thing, it's something that's happened to this space, right? So it's manufactured. So we wondered, you know, what happened to take life away and what would be needed to bring life back, but not life just, and this is where, you know, as much as I really admire a lot of work that's happening, like Black Lives Matter, often that language is used to say a Black life matters at death, right? Like this death is supposed to, now you realize that it matters when a Black life is taken. And so the question I wanted to wrestle with is, what does it mean to have Black life that is a flourishing life, right? A life worth living. A life worth living. Like, what do we need to have this life placed back in the community? And then my sister here reminded me, she said, you know, the things that they need to make a life worth living, that they need in that community, that's already there. That's life that's inside them. This is what we were talking about earlier, talking about that creation narrative, about God created everything, God said it was good.
That's right.
God said it was good, it was done, right? So there's already life in this space, and what's happened is we have, because of this separation that we have put ourselves through, we've forgotten what we already have. What we already, and we have to remember what we have to use the resources that we already have that are empty, as he pointed out, during the week. Yeah. Like, we got the spaces. So it's literally just utilizing the things we already have to live into the life that we already have the capacity to live into, but we have to claim it and own it, and not operate in this deficit mindset, where somebody has to bring us something or label something like that, right? And so I think for me, that to me is this kind of next step of saying, okay, how can we actually be in solidarity with each other to create these kinds of communities where we can allow life to flourish again in this space? And I think you hit the nail, so for me, just realizing how, even though I grew up poor and food insecure, it was a community issue. And so we went over to other people's house and ate when we had some, like it was sharing. And now, you know, those spaces, because of the way segregation works and things work like that, like we have gotten much more separated. And so many of our churches are commuter churches. People drive into those communities, you know. So what would it be like to create communities? You're talking about Black, you know, add somewhere add community into this food security network, right? Where we actually create spaces where we are intentionally about where we live, where we shop, what we do, you know, to build these communities back up to where they can support each other.
Powerful. Oh, and you got him? Okay, yeah.
So I wanted to follow up a little bit on what our group talked about too, because I sort of had this revelation as I was listening to everything. And I don't want to be like the spokesperson for whiteness right now, but I do want to name that I am the first non-melanated person to speak. So we talked about this separation. this separation and lack of community and this exodus, all as symptoms, as you said, of the system that creates and perpetuates gentrification. And I was reminded of Belvedere Square moving in, and as I was thinking about that, it reflects the way that the white community has turned food into a status symbol. Because there's something about carrying a bag that has Whole Foods imprinted on it, or calling yourself a foodie and having the privilege to say, Dr. Carter said that one.
Foodie.
A foodie, you know, somebody who has the privilege of trying a variety of cuisines and going to expensive restaurants for teeny tiny little plates. And the status difference, you know, I live equidistant from a Whole Foods and an Aldi. And for the longest time, even as an adult, I wouldn't set foot into the Aldi because when I was a kid, we had food stamps and Aldi meant you were poor. And so there's this ingrained idea that where you shop and what food you have access to is a reflection of who you are. And that's just what occurred to me as I was listening to everybody. So.
You got some oil on you. You got some oil on you.
So, yeah.
She said non-melanated oil. Oil on you.
So as CJ and myself were talking about this issue, we started asking the question, well, to answer your question, what is a food desert? But the challenge that I think we ran into was the construction of a food desert is primarily based on who can bring resources, first move resources out of the area, and then who brings the resources back in. And then the question then we started to grapple with was, well, so who owns the resources?
Come on.
And once you start going down this line of ownership models, then we start talking about ownership of the means of production,
Yes,
ownership
sir.
of the institutions and the brands, and ownership of the land that produces. And so we run into this very fundamental structural problem of ownership. What you have done is you have taken your ownership strength and power and re-engineered it so it's strength for you and your community. Where I look at it, how I look at it from the lens of the law, I'm not a lawyer. CJ, he's a lawyer. But I look at it from the lens of knowledge ownership or intellectual property. And I think structurally, unless, as a community, each of us here start to think about who owns what and why and how it is we can shift those ownership models legally, theologically, philosophically, then addressing issues of, food deserts and racism and gender issues and all of these other isms that we are contending with becomes very difficult to do. So I just advocate that what you're doing is you're taking ownership, you're using your knowledge, you're harnessing that knowledge and transforming it into something that is viable theologically and economically. And that's the value and power of what I'm seeing with this particular.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I believe your question was, what's problematic about the, so we were discussing, and I'm not a scientist, I think a little bit in terms of what Brooke, my idea of a desert is, every desert that I know of has always been a desert, and there's nothing you can do to not make it a desert. So for me, saying a desert is like hopeless. It's like hopeless. Like, what are you going to do to change the desert? If you try to, the description of a desert is just, obviously there's not a lot of water there. If you add a lot of water, Jeff said, you add a lot of water in a desert, you likely get flash flooding or something like that. The environment just can't handle a lot of water. To what it takes to not make it a desert again. And so if you describe a place as a food desert, then really adding a bunch of food, is that going to not, will it change from being a desert? You're describing something to me, it says that it's hopeless, and it's going to always be that. Because it's a desert. That's what it's supposed to be. Which goes back to what you were saying, that it's a natural state, and what keeps food out of baby's mouth is not natural. It's unnatural. So you're by starting off calling it that, you're pretty much starting off from a hopeless situation. You have to change our vocabulary and change what we call things. And sometimes we get used to. I'm the Black Baptist preacher that has said Abednego is that dude.
I'm complicit.
I've done that. And why, and I have to challenge myself, why am I okay with still calling those boys by their slave names? But it's just comfortable, and that's what we've always done. And so we don't question those things that just we've been told and we've been taught. There's hopelessness in that. That's a hopeless situation this from the same guy whose parents changed their last name and rather have gone with an X than have kept their slave names. I just don't get that. And so just vocabulary and what we call things. To me, desert is a hopeless situation. And so what's the point? It's a desert. They don't deserve grocery stores. They don't deserve it's a desert. Why would we waste our resources and try to water the desert?
Whew. On that point, Dr. Bridgman, do you mind sharing, you were talking about, connected to that worth piece you were speaking to?
Oh, okay. So we were actually having a very fruitful conversation around how these decisions to move grocery stores, big dollar grocery stores, out of communities to someplace else, actually point to the fact that, and I quoted you, Dr. Christopher Carter, that the decisions are made at the level of worth, as in dollar bill. And the reason they can make those decisions at the level of worth is because they don't perceive people in that zip code, in this case we were talking about zip code 43224, as people, as persons, as human. Like, so you can make decisions because flourishing doesn't matter, because only a certain type of human is a person. And so if they're poor, can't help your bottom line, whatever that might mean for the stakeholders. Right. And I have a 403B, so I'm a stakeholder in something. Now I want to go see what people are doing around food in my portfolio, because this, because the dollar is defining who's a person.
Awesome. Where was that hand? David?
So a couple of things as I'm listening. First thought, and kind of piggybacks off of what Dr. Bridgman was just saying, kind of thinking about food deserts and who defines what a food desert is in terms of kind of proximity, and thinking of when we think of these big stores like kind of Whole Foods or all these major markets where they upscale the prices. In my experience, and just kind of thinking recent experience back home, that's often been a precursor for who they're trying to bring into that community to help that business build and to maintain that business. And so it leads to the community that's already established there being forced to either migrate somewhere else to where they can afford something for them, or they're basically driven out because the community around them is kind of sucking their own energy dry, in terms of once one business comes in, then comes another business, and then a third, and then you get this community that is not facilitating or tending to the needs of the people within the community. And I think that's a huge piece of it, but then also thinking about what Ben says about the use of language, and so restructuring the idea of food desert. And I know earlier you mentioned kind of food mirage or food apartheid. And so the use of these kinds of words and the way that we think about kind of the situations that we're in, because language does have power, words matter. How can we change the way that we, even when we say food apartheid, that connotates for people a certain kind of image, a certain kind of mindset, a certain kind of liberationist kind of thought, or food mirage that presents something for the imagination to capture and imagine, whereas desert brings images of despair, hopelessness. And so thinking about just this restructuring of everything, it starts with language, but then also starts with where is this quote-unquote food desert happening, and who's the one saying that it's a food desert? Because a lot of times the food desert in terms of the bottom line may be only a food desert for, in terms of what they consider a food desert is not building on the bottom line, or is building, yes, so.
Thank you. And Casey.
So a couple of alternative points of view. So Kelsey and I talked about the idea that we actually are pretty good at, as a species, at creating deserts. So you cut down all the trees and remove a lot of plants and lose the topsoil, and you get a desert with low soil moisture and very little, or very difficult to bring it back to the state it was. So we do the same thing with food deserts. So we talked about, you know, if you envision kind of the stereotypical food desert, it looks a lot like the poor side of town. I don't know if you've ever, Dr. Kimberly Richards with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond does an exercise where she kind of walks the group through, think about what you're seeing if you are taking a walk and you suddenly realize you're in the poor side of town. And it's cracked pavement, no grocery store, pawn shop, liquor store, you know, this kind of thing is what you're seeing if you're in the poor side of town. And those do correlate pretty strongly with what we tend to call food deserts. But one more alternative point of view, and this wasn't really from our conversation, but something I heard at a meeting once before. It was a young Navajo woman who stood up and, to some of your points, Heber, said, I get tired of hearing you people talk about food deserts all the time. My people live in the desert. We've lived in the desert for 2,000 years. We get everything we need from the desert. And deserts can be very rich, very biologically diverse places. So she said, come up with another name.
That's right.
Hi. I thought that it was very interesting when we were talking about the value of the human.
Yes.
So I just want to share a little bit of my own experience living in South Africa. And I moved to the United States 1 year and 4 months ago, but before my family and I, we came from South Africa. I'm originally from Brazil, not from South Africa. That's why I have this thick accent. So, but when I moved to South Africa, it was 3 years after the end of the apartheid. And when that happened, I found interesting to see the process of trying to bring close the different races. And one of the things that they did very quickly was to construct big malls, shop malls, in the black suburbs. So then you go to these poor areas, and they have these huge, massive, beautiful malls. Like Nettie, she saw that we were in South Africa now in January, a group of students. But inside those malls, when you go to the food court or the restaurants, it's only McDonald's.
Yep.
You know, it's only fast food, but beautiful. The outlook is not like the McDonald's here. It's sophisticated. It's so beautiful because it makes people feel like they're actually going to a place where they're selling good food, but it's that type of food. And then I keep thinking about that the logic of colonization, it's so ingrained, and as the years passed, it started to become so much subtle. Because, okay, there is this plan that black and white now have the same rights. So they have access to the same things. So we have this shop mall. But why is that in the suburbs, where it's most people of color, the type of the food that is going to be served there is so much cheaper, right? And it's fast food. And why is that in the other suburbs, then when you go to the restaurants and you go to the shop mall, it is then organic food, it's family restaurants, it is like a different type of access. Mm-hmm. So this happens across the globe. Yeah. This reality of disregarding people of color, it's not even people of color, it's people of color and poor people. Mm-hmm. People that don't have economic power to actually to spend and to contribute to this huge machine. And so often when I'm listening about food, when I'm listening about the value of the human, it always comes back for me on the economic situation. And what do we understand to be the real value and where we put all of those things? And it comes back to the economic power. It comes back, how do we look, how can we buy, and why don't we go now, start a subsistence farm? Why don't we change the way how we live then? Because it comes back to how much can we access? What is the value of the human? It's how much you can buy. It's how much you can access.
Goes back to the Whole Foods comment. So I just want to do a time check, y'all, because we're rolling, but give me a sec. About 8 minutes. Good luck with that. Where? Oh.
Just a quick one. You mentioned Paulo Freire, and one of the key critiques would be banking model of education. You can flip that very parallel to the banking model of food.
Wow.
So how the banking model of education dehumanizes, it takes away agency because everything looks fixed and you're just dependent on someone else. The same arguments for food banking. It's dependency and creation.
That's rich. Thank you for that. When I preach it, I'll give you credit. That's good. That's good.
I want to thank my sister for talking about the malls. My favorite grocery store is a chain, and the store where I go to, I frequently pick up chicken salad sliders when I have a meeting to run to. Mm-hmm. Well, I wound up at another branch of the same store, and it was in a darker neighborhood, although I didn't realize that.
Melanated, perhaps?
A melanated neighborhood, but I didn't know that until I went in the store, and I couldn't find the chicken salad sliders. And I asked somebody, and they said, oh, we sell the chicken salad and we sell the buns, and you can go home and make them. And then I walked over to the seafood section and discovered that that store sold whole catfish, which I cannot get in the store I normally go to. What can I say?
So when we spoke about ownership, we distinguished that, there are at least two tiers of ownership. So there's ownership just of resources. So for example, I own this phone, I own this pen. But then there's, the other tier, right? The rich and the rest of us. Those of us who own the rights to these things. Mm-hmm. So those, that by our ownership, we're making them richer, right? In their ownership. So I think that's something that we have to also keep in mind as we talk about food, right? It's especially as people are trying to patent certain seeds and,
yes,
infiltrating countries and stealing and pillaging, and it's just colonialism all over again in a different form through intellectual property and, ownership of those rights. So.
Great point. Great. And I think,
a couple of random thoughts. One, Las Vegas used to be a desert. Okay. And it is not now because someone found a way to profit from making it not a desert. Random thought number two, I was driving through my neighborhood one day and I saw a sign that says, Little Caesars, you can feed a family of 5 for $5.99. And this was in a food desert. Third random thought was today in your sermon, you talked about people who thought they were better off before integration than after. And to me, that made a lot of sense. I've talked about that a lot of times. We, as a community, after integration, because of the way this country was formed, we always admired the powerful. And after integration, we had a chance to sit with the powerful. But just sit with the powerful. We didn't have the power. Our power, our communities were dispersed at that time. And understanding how this country runs, a country who subsidizes a certain product so that the good stuff, you pay more for it. And see, once you understand that, you can go out and get a bag of butter beans and put them in soak for $1.79 and feed that family of 5. So there has to be a switch in thinking and grow our own food. And the thought of a desert or a mirage or whatever wouldn't even matter if we took control of our communities and exercised some common sense and fed ourselves.
Thank you. And really give everybody a hand. I'm going to close out just by honoring, and there's so many notes I have here around ownership, notes around what it means to help usher in life and invite flourishing in so-called food deserts. The question of worth and let me see, a hopelessness that's attached to the desert. I love the piece about we can create deserts too. And creating, I want to, if I had the time, I would invite us to create more space for our complicity in the current food system that is unjust and that is inviting the dehumanizing that Elaine spoke to and many others spoke to as well. How are we complicit? That could be a question that we sit with and sit in the tension of that, our complicity there. And I think as we come to terms and sit with our complicity, then that can help lead us to what pedagogy of the press, Freddie talks about in terms of transformative action. First, we got to confess. That complicity piece, wrestle with the terms, and even push back against forces and factors that monetize us using those terms. Because if you want to get a grant these days, we know what buzz phrases and catch words to use in order to get the grant. But how can we push back in that and then again sit with our complicity and then dream again about what it means and what it would look like to engage in transformative action around a system that impacts us all. Y'all are amazing. Thank you so much. Give yourselves again another hand. Oh.
And while you're giving yourself a hand, let's please also give Dr. Heber Brown III